All right. So we left off talking about something called the founder effect. Does anybody know how to get rid of that thing on the side? So that I can just make this big.
Tools at the top right above the sidebar says tools.
Ah, you are good. What a good, smart guy.
It bugged me for a long time, so I figured that.
Thank you, sir. Okay. So we're talking about change in populations, and we're talking about some of the reasons why we might see changes in populations of a different species. We left off talking about something called the founder's effect. Now, when a few individuals, and again, think of a whole big, giant group of the same species, when a few individuals, for some reason, get isolated, they're on a desert island, they are responsible for then doing what? For that species? Repopulating. And what happens to the gene pool? It gets much smaller because those are the only ones that are doing what? Reproducing and giving offspring in that area. And that's what the founder's effect talks about. So it represents some genetic drift, some change in the gene pool due to that small little group's isolation. The founder effect also explains the relatively high frequency of certain inherited disorders. So if the people or the animals or the bugs in that small population have a certain genetic abnormality or disorder, that's going to be enhanced in the population due to the founder's effect. Does that make sense? But only in those little groups. So gene flow, another source of evolutionary change, separate from the genetic drift, genetic exchange with another population, and this is sort of how it happens normally, because different populations are different groups, especially if they migrate to different areas, we have normal gene flow in those groups. It can result in a gain or a loss of alleles and tends to reduce genetic differences between populations. So we get a more uniform group due to gene flow, when we don't isolate groups, when we mix up the gene pool. Does that make sense? Kinda? Sorta? Maybe? So, of all cases of microevolution, only natural selection promotes adaptation. Causes. What did I say? Cases. You're right. Your causes. It's hard to read sideways. So what does that statement mean? Adaptation. What is adaptation? Yeah, I want you to tell me.
Only natural selection promotes adaptation, meaning that natural selection, because of natural selection, the population will either thrive or disintegrate due to the environment they're in.
Correct. Okay, so the population is adapted to the environment it lives in. Thank goodness. Well, actually it does, because if you look at Hardy-Weinberg and that formula, guess what that is? So evolutionary adaptation results from change in random generation, genetics, variability, sorting in the unequal reproductive success among varying individuals. So it all comes down to reproductive success, doesn't it? Whatever the organism is, it has to be able to do what? Live long enough to pass its genes to its offspring. We might see a mutation that's amazing and wonderful, but if that organism with the mutation doesn't reproduce and pass it down, it ends with what? It ends with that organism. So relative fitness, the contribution an individual makes to the gene pool of the next generation. relative to the contributions of other individuals. So, again, contributions to offspring, to the next generation. That's important. So that's about it for chapter 13. Next, on to chapter 14. So diversity, change, difference. How did that come about? Now, when we talk about founder's effect and genetic drift and isolation of populations, some different events throughout the history of the Earth have done that to different species. Over the past 600 million years, how old is the Earth? Billions, 4 billion years old. Let's use that as an average, okay? 4 billion years. 600 million is pretty small compared, yes? Yeah. See, it's a good thing you know math. So 600 million years of fossil record reveals 5 different periods of extinction, when 50 to 90% of living species suddenly were wiped out for one reason or another. Drastic conditions seem to be the culprit every time. There have been lesser periods in which there were less than 50% losses. But these 5 are the big losses. Mass extinction. Is there another one to come?
Yeah.
Who knows? Yeah, we're doing a good job, aren't we? Results in new species which increases biological diversity. Well, I don't know so much about new species, but what happens to the species that exist? Well, that's a crappy slide. Yeah, the bottleneck, exactly. Where is that?
They got to rely on that old mutated cell.
Exactly. And then what? Bottom line. No, it's over on page 281. There's a geologic time scale.
Did you hear they just found the 24,000 year old Indian Asian person?
24,000-year-old?
Beautiful mummy.
24,000. Where they realized that the American Indian was really a descendant of Asia, not Europe. 24,000 years old. But that's not long enough for evolution.
What, is it a different species?
No.
24,000 years old.
And we're the exact same. Eyes, nose, mouth, ears, hands, fingers.
Yeah, does make sense, doesn't it? Right. Makes sense to me. So, 5 largest known mass extinctions. 430 million years ago, 360 million years ago, 243 million, 208 million, and most recently 63 million. And that's the one I think we all are familiar with, the dinosaur one. Correct. Well, not all living species were extinct in these mass extinctions. So some lived through the extinction.
Birds are just descendants of pterodactyl and crocodiles.
And crocodiles, exactly. So adaptations to the environment and changes, right? Made changes, and that's where that statement about new species.
But that also had to do with, what is it, Pangaea. So all of a sudden, mom and dad were living in an island, things that go servers for food, and all of a sudden, new species.
Right. Or because of isolation in populations.
Right.
And then adaptation and mutation.
Right. It might not have anything to do with extinction. It could have something to do with just
isolation.
Isolation.
Yeah, in general. But unfortunately, we see that in those time periods, we see that many species were killed off. So your statement is very true. It's not necessarily due to the fact that they're all wiped out. It's due to the fact that those are the only ones left behind to then repopulate.
And then isolated from each other.
Correct. So, current rate of extinction over the past 400 years indicates that we may be living in and contributing to the 6th mass extinction period. And give me some examples right off the top of your head of different species that are disappearing.
Tigers, pandas,
Polar bears, tigers, pandas.
Black rhinoceros species.
Yeah, rhinos. Okay. Yeah, that's very, very bad one. Yes.
Some bats too.
They'll destroy agriculture.
Exactly. And we destroy agriculture, we destroy ourselves. So we have to be careful. So, these mass extinctions are going to pave the way for the evolution of new diverse forms. But it takes millions of years for that to happen. So is it going to happen in 24,000 years? Macroevolution and the diversity of life. So macroevolution encompasses the major biological changes evident in the fossil record. And again, is the fossil record a complete? No. Exactly. And we see the formation of new species, but again, there's a lot of missing pages to that book. Speciation, one species evolving from 2 or more new species, is the focal point of macroevolution, and may occur based on 2 contrasting patterns. One is called non-branching, and the other one is called branching. So we see lots and lots of changes occurring in different species when we see isolation. What makes a species a species?
Their looks, the characteristics of traits.
They can only reproduce within their species.
Correct. So what happens is there's enough of a change so that those like individuals only mate with other like individuals. So even though these 2 guys are birds, not all birds will mate with all birds. And what happens is the gene pool tends to get narrower and narrower, and we create that species. So this is a result of speciation. So even though we see that these guys are still birds, we see that these guys and these guys are very different, or these guys are the same, and this guy is different than the original that it was thought to have come from. And they sort of branch off and change their mating characteristics. Biological species concept defines a species as a group of populations whose members have the potential to breed together and produce fertile offspring. Even though breeding happens and can happen between species, the key is what? Yeah, being able to breed again. So again, when we see that new thing in that example, donkey and horse can breed, right? But is the mule able to? No. Did you know that? Mules are sterile. So we see that new individual, but they can't carry on because it's sterile. So we have to have some sort of reproductive success in order for us to see that new species on board. So species is a Latin word meaning a kind and appearance. And we know now that we have more information, it's not just appearance, it's what? Yeah, those alleles, the genetics, and the success of an offspring. There's lots of diversity within a species. So here's some similarities between different species. Can you even tell some of the differences here? Yeah, but not, you have to look really close, right? You see a very distinct color pattern, but here you see a change in beak and head size, right? Body size is bigger here than here. And then what can these two different but similar things do? Different. Yeah, utilize the food source. And typically, that's one of the key factors in creating or nurturing a new species to appearance. We have to have enough what for this species to survive? Enough food. Enough food to get strong and old enough to do what? Reproduce.
I was going to say that the environments are different too.
Right. So this is more of an, it looks like more of a desert type environment, and there's more plant life, more water. Correct. This one probably has to do a lot of digging for its food, finding it where it's hiding away from the elements. So this is your species, but lots of diversity, yes? Now what's the diversity caused from? Not necessarily environment. Changes, mutations, yes? Still within the same species, still breed with the same species, but we see diversity within species. So if I look at some of these different birds within the same species, they're not going to all look exactly the same. They're going to have different patterns, and usually those patterns are nurtured by their environment. Darker skinned people tend to do better where? Where there's a lot of what? Sun exposure for long periods of time.
If they were together, they were in close proximity, they could probably reproduce.
Probably, yeah.
Because it would be the same species. Those two yellow birds are the same species.
Well, similarities between different species. These are different species of birds, but they're very similar in appearance. That would be the key, exactly. So the biological species concept cannot be applied in all situations. Well, we don't know what the fossils did. We just know we have fossils. We know what they look like. We're not sure how they reproduced or who they reproduced with. And then we also have organisms that don't need a mate to reproduce. So those organisms are called what? Asexual organisms. And how do we tell that from the fossil record? It would be difficult. Just because I don't necessarily have a male or female of a certain type doesn't mean that that one didn't exist. It might be missing in the record. So reproductive barriers between species also account for that bottleneck or separation from one species to the next as the years go on. Prezygotic barrier. What's a zygotic? What's zygote?
That's both words and embryos.
So that's during the developmental stages. Prevent mating or fertilization between species. Certain zygotes won't survive with certain genetic material. They include temporal isolation. Breeding time may be the same. Or, may not be the same. So certain individuals of a certain species might have a breeding cycle that don't match up with another species. Or what? What's that called? Yeah, incubation periods, exactly. What's the incubation period for a human? 40 weeks. It's called the gestation period. And that's the development of that particular species before birth. So habit isolation, and again, those birds in different places. One likes to hang out in the desert, the other one likes to hang out in the forest. They tend not to hang out together. Habit isolation, behavioral isolation, different mating rituals between birds, for example, certain calls. Birds will only answer to calls of their own species.
Deer, same
Yeah. So deer, what's some of the ways one deer attracts another?
way. Correct.
Different sounds, different noising, different scents. We as humans, we've kind of lost the ability to have the keen sense that many animals, huh?
We're called dull nose.
Yeah, definitely. And if you look at our nervous system makeup, there's a certain group of neurons that sends messages about scent to your brain for processing. It's called the olfactory bulbs. And we have little dinky, useless olfactory bulbs, where if you look at the olfactory bulb of a sheep or a deer or a moose, you see they're much, much larger. So they use olfactory smell information to process their environment a lot more than we do. Mechanical isolation, anatomical differences that prevent breeding because of the way different species breed, or fertilization in different species takes place. Gamete isolation. Gametes are not compatible. We saw that different species have different numbers of chromosomes. We saw that changes in chromosome number in our species, for example, can lead to what? Well, disabilities. And what happens to the offspring with some of these mutations? Are they viable? Some are, but some aren't. So, prezygotic barriers, temporal isolation. I think this is in, where is this? We're kind of pulling from different places in the book. And this is on, yeah, it's on page 272 and 273 in your textbook. So we see two closely related species of skunk mate at different times of the year. So are these two species going to mate? No, because one becomes fertile at a totally different time than the other one does. Habitat isolation, desert versus aquatic, for example, in these two snakes. Behavioral isolation. These two, they're so cool. You can't see it in the thingy, but they have blue feet. They're called the blue-footed boobies. Mate only after a specific ritual of high stepping. And won't mate unless that happens. Mechanical isolation. Again, their parts aren't in the same place. So their gametes never come together. And then gamete isolation. And we see two different colors. Better to look in the book. The pictures don't come out so good here. So postzygotic barriers operate if interspecies mating occurs and hybrid zygotes form. Again, what do those zygotes have to be? Well, they have to be viable. They have to be able to grow, be viable in their environment, and live long enough to reproduce, exactly. So postzygotic barriers include reduced hybrid viability, reduced hybrid fertility, and then those hybrids end up breaking down, being pretty much the only one that exists and is the end-all be-all for that particular one. Now, what might happen through time if we take the horse and the donkey and keep mating them?
We might find one fertile.
We might eventually get a mule that's fertile. Okay, well, what if we only have one fertile mule?
Popular.
Then we've lost it.
Right. So again, it takes thousands and thousands of years for these to occur.
One of those ligers that they
Yeah.
which is kind of cool.
So if we can kind of take that mule then, say we got that one fertile mule, and then maybe cross it with a donkey and keep it going.
It doesn't have to take thousands and thousands of years, it has to take thousands and thousands of generations.
And how long does it take for a mule?
I don't know, but humans can do accelerated experiments, they do it all the time.
Now, how long would it take you to be able to reproduce as a human?
Takes us what? 9 months? No, it takes us, you gotta be 10, 12, something like that.
No, say average 13 years. Yeah. Yes? How long for,
I don't know. They only-
probably about the same?
Horse one lives 20 years, right?
No, horse lives a long time. Yeah.
They're hay burners to me, so I don't know.
They're cute hay burners. So, key event in the potential origin of a species occurs when a population is severed from other populations of the parent species. And that seems to be able to get things going a little bit faster. If I am in a huge population, what happens to my gene pool? It's more varied and more consistent in a large population. So when we start isolating, that's when we seem to see speciation take place at a faster rate. A new species can form by allopatric speciation, and that's due to geographic isolation, which blocks the gene flow into and out of a group or population. Sympatric speciation, where we see new species without geographic isolation. And when a new species forms, it can no longer reproduce with other older species. So it's very hard for new species to come about, and takes a lot of what? Generations in whatever that species is. So again, we see different populations here of what? Trees. In allopatric speciation, when we're separated by big areas of land. Sympatric, when we start to see differences within a population. So you see the difference between the two. So geological processes can fragment a population into two or more isolated populations, contribute to an allopatric speciation, and speciation occurs only with the evolution of reproductive barriers between the isolated population and its parent population. So again, it all comes down to, is this species able to reproduce and pass those changes on to what? Offspring. We see two little, what do those guys look like? Oh, chipmunks. And we see
Have you ever seen Up?
we see a description of these guys on page 275 in our textbook. And they were separated by what? Yeah, kind of hard for one of those little guys to jump over the canyon. Unless Evel Knievel is his friend, right? So we see a difference there. Oop, what happened there?
I was wondering what that said.
It talks about barriers between the isolated population. How the heck? Wait a minute. Maybe we can go in and separate them. No, because it's a... No, that doesn't help. Talks about...
Print that way.
It didn't print that way? Did it separate?
Oh, no, it's printed that way. Not on mine.
No? What's it say?
Speciation occurs only when the evolution of reproductive, and then it's dash, and its speciation occurs with the evolution of barriers
Yep, that little diagram. So again, geographic barriers can create or enhance speciation. When a group of individuals is isolated reproductively, they only can reproduce with that isolated population. So we enhance what? Or differences, which can then result in a new species. We've been isolated? Really?
Amazon, the tribe in Africa, how many years? There's probably still a tribe out there somewhere that hasn't had any contact with anybody else in the outside world.
Yeah. And if you look at their genetics, what might you find?
I would say it would probably be just like
It's some of the differences.
what we
For the majority might be the same.
They might have a special disease that's just
Say it loud.
They might just have a specialized disease that's just central to them because their gene pool was so small it stayed there.
Correct.
Wasn't there some that have those lobster hands?
No, no one said it wasn't a species.
No, nobody said it's a new species, but there's diversity within species, isn't there?
Yeah, but those two right there, it says populations cannot interbreed.
Yeah, because they've created an isolation and created a new species. It didn't say it was done in 10 years. Did it?
You're never gonna get where each other.
That's right, because humans are humans.
We didn't count them.
You didn't come from anything else. Okay. Sympatric speciation occurs while the new species and old species live in the same time and in the same place. So again, what has to happen? Yeah, they have to be able to reproduce and produce what? Viable offspring. So if a genetic change produces a reproductive barrier between the old and the new, now we have even more enhanced factors to create a new what? A new species. Polyploids can originate from accidents during cell division. What's a polyploid? Poly means what? Many. So more genes, more genetics than the original. That can happen during cell division, but we have to be a viable result. And this results from the hybridization of two parent species. So parent species coming together, creating offspring that are a little bit different. Again, the key is they have to be viable offspring. Correct. And why? Because of, at some point, if we come from similar ancestors, at some point the separation was too great for us to then.
We were able to breed with the Neanderthals, weren't we? Because we said there's some genes in Neanderthals
Well,
and humans.
correct.
Like a small percent.
Right.
Some.
Mm-hmm. And does that species exist anymore? No. So many domesticated plants are the result of sympatric speciation. Oats, potatoes, bananas, peanuts, apples, coffee, wheat, all due to these interminglings of different species, resulting in a viable offspring that can then pass their offspring, pass their genetics to their offspring and have viable offspring. So what is the tempo of speciation? Two contrasting models of the pace of evolution. We can have a gradual model, and that's big changes Speciations occur by the steady accumulation of many little small changes. Or we can have something called a punctated equilibria. And what is that? Yeah, it's faster because the change causes enough of a change to separate it as a species. So it can happen, right? Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen.
Has happened.
Yeah?
Called mass extinction.
And which results in new species because of,
Isolation and evolvement.
correct. So punctated model over time and graduated model over time. Again, it basically just comes down to, are the changes viable in offspring? And can those offspring have more offspring? What accounts for the evolution of biological novelty? Birds, for example. They are derived or thought to be derived from a long lineage of earthbound reptiles, evolved flight from flightless ancestors because of changes in what? It changes in those limbs, not necessarily the environment, but they were able to utilize what? Well, they took their mutation and exploited it, right? They were able to, a bird, for example, can go to the top of a tree and utilize a food source that something that is bound to the ground cannot utilize. So what if, in a certain environment, we have a food source that runs out on ground level that these guys can then exploit because they have this mutation? Yes?
They survive, kill themselves.
Correct. They can live long enough, get strong enough to have what? Viable offspring and pass those changes on. So, an exaptation is a structure that evolves in one context but becomes adapted for another function. So, again, birds, wings, feathers. I was able to do what with fly because why? Yeah, and they're hollow and light. Now, maybe if that particular creature was still stuck on the ground with a whole bunch of dinosaurs, what might have happened to those hollow, light bones? Hey, you got crushed, see you later. But because they were able to utilize a different source in their environment, they were able to survive. They can account for the gradual evolution of novel structures. And again, wings or fins fall into this category. Subtle changes in a species' developmental program can be profound effects, changing the rate, the timing, the spatial pattern of development. Devo, evolutionary developmental biology, is a study of the evolution of developmental processes in multicellular organisms. Yeah, those little hats. Often due to the duplication of what? Homeotic genes, homo, same. Duplication of similar genes, extra copies of similar genes can result in different structures. Again, what does the organism have to be? Viable. So homeotic genes are master control genes that regulate structure development, how the structure develops, where the structure develops. Mutations in these genes can profoundly affect the outcome. So these little this group of controller genes that control similar structures and where those structures are going to be during embryonic development might result in a very different outcome. Yeah, exactly. Now, if I had an arm, say I had an arm on the back of my head, these guys would control a structure that you normally had, your arms, but now cause it to be somewhere else, the back of your head. Well, that'd be great in my house, because you can grab those kids as they're trying to run away, right? And if that allowed me to utilize a better food source than my two-armed friends, and allowed me to reproduce more successfully, we might see more of those in the population. Or, who knows, if it's enough of a change, maybe the three-armed, one in the back of the head people can only reproduce together. We create a new species. You with me? So, how do we pronounce that word? Yep. Is the retention into an adulthood of features that were solely juvenile in ancestral species. When I think of embryology and I think of gills, you had them during your embryonic development, right? Did your ancestors have them? Were they functional then? Why aren't they functional in you? This has occurred in the evolution of salamanders, and it has also occurred in the evolution of humans. So if you look at the skull of a chimpanzee versus an adult human, what do we see? Where are the differences? Teeth, because of what? Probably food source, right? How they have to utilize their food. Size, the biggest difference there is what? Yeah, the size of the cranium, the brain size. Look at the fetus of both. What do we see? Pretty damn close, right? A lot of similarities. So we see differences in similar structures as that particular species, different species, develops into adulthood. So we see about the same cranial size, but for some reason, changes in human, if you believe that humans come from something similar to chimpanzee, a change occurred where the brain grows at a faster rate into adulthood, and the cranium size accommodates that. So that's what that talks about. So macroevolution is closely tied to the history of the Earth. Again, fossil record is the sequence of which fossils appear in that rock strata. The older ones are where? On the bottom. The younger ones are at the top. An archive of what we call that macroevolution. So imprints or actual parts of an organism, very seldom do we exactly recover a whole organism. So, is our fossil record complete? No. And then a lot of times what we do is discover groups of bones in a large area. And we think we do a great job of putting together a complete skeleton, but we might have what? Different pieces from different.
I forget what museum has the
Tyrannosaurus?
No.
Triceratops?
Half of was from a totally different, the back legs were
Yeah.
from a totally different dinosaur. They weren't even that poor big legs, but they were so close in shape and size that they just used them. But then we fixed it with plaster, so now it has the right
The correct bones in the
Yeah.
correct place.
but
So one of the what
forever, they had the wrong bones with the dinosaur.
Yep. And then forever, you see the drawings of that, and you see the renderings according to the skeleton of that for years and years and years, and then all of a sudden we're like, oh, oops.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that is helping us with that is the ability to do genetic mapping, if there's viable material left. So being able to do that has been able to help us see some of the differences in different species that are out there, even though they're very, very similar in structure.
They just found a whole treasure trove of fossils.
They also
The government
found,
said you've got this much time. They weren't even close to getting to the bottom of it. The government said, I don't care. They bulldoze it all in and build houses on top of it.
They have found two complete mammoths, a baby and an adult, in, I forget, the ice.
Tar pits or ice?
No, it was in ice, in the tundra, in the permafrost.
Yeah.
They tried to get DNA out of the baby mammoth.
See, those environments are like gold. If you could find something that's been preserved like that, it's gold.
They have holes in the ground into the permafrost, and you can walk through there, take a tour, and on the walls is all bone fossils. They haven't labeled what they are.
In what year?
It's pretty cool. It's
It
not
is.
like hell out there. It's really cool.
Yeah, because it's all rotting, decaying organisms from years and years and years. So, again, our fossil record is not complete, and we learn more and more as we find more and more all the time. So, geologists have established a geologic time scale reflecting a consistent sequence of geologic periods. And that's what that wonderful craziness on page, whatever the heck that is, page 281 shows us. So we seem to find certain organisms in certain pages of our geologic time scale. And we're able to tell some of the different mass extinctions during different time periods and look at the organisms that are left behind. So where's the youngest on here? Yeah, the top, and the oldest down here. How old? As far as we know, right? Could it be older? And that's what we kind of have to wrap our heads around, that time scale. 4.6 billion years, and some of the changes that can occur. Fossils are reliable chronological records only if we can determine their ages. And again, we're not always able to determine their ages. Relative age of a fossil reveals a sequence in which groups or species evolved. But again, there might be missing pages. The absolute age of a fossil requiring other methods such as radiometric dating. We can guesstimate the average age of. So, it's the most common method of dating fossils, and it's based on the decay of radioactive isotopes. Carbon-14 is one of the most common radioactive or radiometric radioactive dating used. And that is what we have used to develop this geologic time scale. Might we find out that we were missing something? Absolutely. And that happens all the time. So radioactive decay over thousands of years. We see that carbon-14, again, is very common. Carbon-14 in that nice, wonderful living shell. And years looking at what's left gives us an idea of how old it is. But again, maybe it had more than what we're estimating. Maybe it had less than what we're estimating. Factors. Exactly. And then something that's so old might, again, have had a lot more or a lot less than we're estimating. We're basing it on things today and known things today, exactly. Well, definitely not, but at least it gives us a guesstimate, a time frame. Plate tectonics and macroevolution. What's plate tectonics? Yeah, the Earth's. Did you know you were floating right now? We're constantly, huh? We're spinning and floating. My husband has this little globe he got as a gift from somebody, and it's a tiny little globe that spins with the rotation of the Earth.
Oh, that is cool.
So it shows, yeah, it shows you how fast you're actually moving. Do you feel like you're moving?
I did yesterday.
Why?
I was outside cutting wood yesterday, it was like 50 miles an hour.
Oh, yeah, that's true. It was scary. The wind was scary yesterday. So, continents are not locked in place. They drift about the Earth's surface on plates of crusts floating on a flexible layer called a mantle. So the Earth as we know it today was not the Earth as it was, say, 100 million years ago, right? Places were different. There was connections, land connections that no longer exist because water has separated them, just like that Grand Canyon. That was once a big, huge, flat area until this little trickle of water started down the center. Yeah. Well, now it's not a little trickle of water, right? So we see things like the San Andreas Fault, and that's in California, at a border where two plates slide past each other. Can cause disruption to everything above. And might cause what to happen?
Earthquake.
Yeah, earthquake, earth crack, earth separation.
Sinkholes.
I knew a guy in California that had his land split in the middle by San Andreas.
Oh.
He had a shed on one side, his house was on the other. The shed is left with his neighbor's land because of the
Shift.
over time, over 20 years.
Did you know you live here? We don't think of Maine as being a big fault area. Yeah, but it is.
There's more seismic activity in Maine than there's anywhere else.
It just is a little what? It's not as pronounced, so we are not aware of it as much as, say, California is, because it doesn't cause as much disruption. But that separation, even though small here, to a small creature can be what? Can be gigantic, can be huge. So about 250 million years ago, plate movements formed the supercontinent called what? Pangea. Get my little what's this out of the way.
Last week's trivia question.
Was it? Up on the board? Total amount of shoreline was reduced, sea level dropped, dry continental interior increased in size, and many what? Extinctions occurred because something that was used to living in a water environment no longer had what?
Water.
No longer had water to survive. So unless it could move with the water and got stuck behind, or didn't get stuck behind, moved with the water, it got stuck behind and either had to have some kind of change happen to it so it could do what? Live in that less water environment, or it did what? It died. About 180 million years ago, Pangea began to do what? Break up into very large continents that drifted apart. Climates changed. We see climate in my very short lifetime. I see very, very subtle climate changes. Yes? So what's some of the climate changes I see in my very short lifetime? Yeah, when I was younger, a lot more snow, right? Which meant a lot more water. Now what's happening? Yeah, the sky is falling. But there are changes in our environment, okay, because we live in a closed bubble.
Yeah, but we haven't been keeping records long enough to know just how many cycles this Earth goes through.
Oh, we have. We know that Earth has gone through cycles like this very similarly in many years past. We know that carbon tends to build up in our environments and then go down in our environments. It's cycles. We know that. We can look at what to see that? Yeah, ice formation over time.
But that, again, that's a faulty record.
Correct, because some years we might have what?
Asteroid could hit it.
Or a lot more melting in some years, not leaving us with data for a large period of time.
Geological occurrences that contribute to different amounts of whatever you're looking for in that ice.
Correct.
That you can't say definitively.
Nope.
This is what happened. This is how it happened. This is how it's gonna happen.
Nope. You're absolutely right.
Tell you need to pay.
No, but you can look at a trend. And what do we see with respect to carbon formation in our environment? We have a cycle in carbon formation. That's evident throughout our entire history. We get a large accumulation, then it dips down, and it happens at certain rates throughout our geologic history. What do we see since the industrial evolution and human? More carbon at a what? Faster rate than it's ever been in the history of the planet. At least as far as we can see.
One super volcano with more carbon than the
Yeah, we know that.
entire time of the planet. All of Yellowstone has to do with blow. An asteroid comes down and it's Earth-killing event.
Correct.
Well, that's
Another mass extinction.
right.
Right. But we can see trends in the environment. Do you agree with that, or do you not agree?
Trends, and then you can interpret that data to fit whatever ideological thing you got going on.
Okay. So, we know that climates change, and do change depending on where we are on the Earth. Organisms in the different biological realms change because they utilize what? Or can utilize the food source in a different area in those environments. So plate tectonics explain why Mesozoic reptiles in Ghana, in West Africa, and in Brazil look so familiar. Because at one point, maybe what? They were right next to each other and that got separated. Like the chipmunks, exactly. How marsupials were free to evolve in isolated areas like Australia. So what's a marsupial? Well, they give birth to live young, but the live young are very, very small, and they're not viable in their environment. So they stay where? In that little pouch and grow to a certain point before they actually go out on their own into the environment. Plates are separated pieces of Earth's crust that are free to move. And again, create a separation between groups or populations. So why do you think marsupials evolved? Or maybe holding on to your young for longer periods of time allowed them to live for longer periods of time. So maybe they were more successful as a group, and that worked better in that environment for them. Well, that individual lived long enough to do what? Pass it on to other individuals. So, fossil record reveals that 5 mass extinctions have occurred over the last 600 million years, but we're 4.2 billion years old. 4.6, right? Could there have been more? Yes. So the Permian mass extinction occurred at about the time the merging continents formed the Pangea over 250 million years ago, and claimed about 96% of what?
Yeah, why is there's covered water covered up?
But maybe what happened to the water?
There wasn't as much shallow water, there was more deep water, so.
More deep water. So they weren't able to do what?
Majority of marine life lives in shallow water.
Yeah, and utilize what? Resources that come from what? Land. Also, what else do we see in deep water versus shallow water that might affect the way an organism thrives? Temperature, light, big one. Pressure. Okay, so some of these organisms weren't able to sustain the high pressure.
Because the Earth was all in one continent, Pangea, there wasn't shallow water.
There was, but there wasn't as much of it because most of it was formed in the land, so there was less shoreline, so there was less shallow water.
But what are we finding now with the ability to go down into environments under high pressure that we haven't been able to go down to before? Exactly. So we're seeing more and more life forms that we thought didn't exist because of those radical differences. We're seeing that there are organisms that were actually able to survive in these environments. We're constantly discovering new species.
Bacteria that lives in these caves like 2 miles deep that grow off rocks, live in like toxic water.
Exactly, sulfur-ridden water that we thought for years and years nothing could live in. We thought for years and years nothing could live in the acidic environment of our stomach. Well, guess what? We're wrong. Because there's certain organisms, bacteria, simple organisms, that can live in that environment. One that actually is highly attributed to people who have ulcers. It's called Helicobacter pylori. And that's a recent discovery. So we're constantly discovering new species, changing our frame of thought. Huh?
See,
It is cool, isn't it?
that's way cooler than math.
Don't diss the math. So, the Cretaceous extinction occurred at the end of the Cretaceous period about 65 million years ago. Included the extinction, and that's kind of the popular one we're all familiar with, the extinction of dinosaurs, except for birds. And permitted the rise of who?
The things that the dinosaurs eat.
Mammals. Why do you think this environment was conducive to the mammal?
Because there's more food.
Well, how did a dinosaur reproduce? Yeah, it was an egg-laying individual. Now, we, mammals, well, we eat eggs. No, but I'm thinking, think about the reproductive success. Why do you think mammals were more reproductively successful?
Because they didn't need to babysit an egg.
Somebody's saying protected. Your embryo, your fetus was protected from the environment. And when the environment became so harsh, those who laid eggs and had their young separated from them weren't as reproductively successful. And they ended up demise. Because maybe they were able to fly someplace or protect their young by putting it up out of reach. What happened down here on the land? Food became scarce, so anything that could utilize a food source that was something that other organisms like dinosaurs, big, huge organisms, they needed a lot to survive. But they couldn't utilize certain food sources anymore because what happened? Well, they were destroyed or out of reach or frozen in the ground. So something that could tolerate the temperatures or move to a place, a warmer temperature, like the who, yeah, that do that still, what do? They fly south for the winter, right? They're going to be more reproductively successful.
They said that mass extinction
Again, think of higher versus lower. Think of your house. No, it would cool it off, and it would block what? Block the sun, which would cool it off even more. And again, the disruption of the environment. You know, less water, less light. Less light's going to lead to less what? A lot of the dinosaurs, believe it or not, were what? They were herbivores. So they relied a lot on plants. So less plants, less food, colder environment, right? So all of those factors led to their extinction. So, did a meteor kill the dinosaurs? It helped. You think it helped? 65 million years ago, the fossil record showed that the climate cooled, the seas were receding, many plant species died out, and dinosaurs, except for birds, became extinct. A thin layer of clay, rich in what? Irradium was deposited, and that's kind of how we see some of the things that might have been the demise of the dinosaurs. Well,
Heavy metal.
very heavy. It sinks.
The fact that it was in a layer across the whole globe, but it was more concentrated in our area.
Yeah.
Because it was right there in Mexico where it impacted.
Correct. So again, we're speculating that the highest amount of this substance was probably closer to the source that dropped it there, which was in the Mexico region. So, is the irradium layer the result of fallout from a huge cloud of dust that billowed into the atmosphere after a large meteor or asteroid hit it? Mass extinction 65 million years ago was caused by the impact of an extraterrestrial object. That's the hypothesis. Something that came from not of this planet. Huge impact created a crater of the right age, should be found somewhere on the Earth's surface, or creating a crater. So where was it found? Yucatan Peninsula. Huge impact crater was found there. Dated from the predicted time, so again, kind of in the same time frame, based on deposit of iridium amount, based on carbon dating, was about the right size, was capable of creating a cloud that would have blocked enough sunlight to change the Earth's climate for long enough to do what? Kill off those huge organisms that needed so much food source in order to survive. So maybe we went from huge organisms at that time to the smaller ones that didn't need a lot of what? Who says they were dumb? Maybe they were wicked smart. Because there was nothing to eat. So, let's pick up with clarifying the diversity of life next week. Yeah, but you know, if I finish the chapter, you're going to have a quiz. So if I don't finish the chapter, you're not going to have a quiz. And you can enjoy the turkey.